Greetings, podcast listeners. After a long unanticipated break, welcome back to a new episode of my podcast. The upcoming episodes of my podcast symbolise a new era for the podcast. I'll be shying away from focusing on the Cambridge GCSE and AS A-level curriculums, as I'm now studying at university. Instead, these episodes will look at a wider range of topics and events that have taken place throughout history. I've just written an essay about the changing role of monarchs in the modern period, and with this episode, I'll be discussing a key event: the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a decisive point in history, often cited as being the beginning of the global age of revolutions. In France, revolution saw the end of King Louis XVI's absolute rule with his execution. It paved the way for democracy, republicanism, and nationalism. The rights of people greatly improved in the next century, starting with the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, sparkling the ideas of freedom, equality, and collective solidarity. The events of the French Revolution contributed to the spread of Enlightenment ideas. Of course, the end of the French monarchy and Louis XVI's execution was a key event in this, but so was the rule of Napoleon. Let's begin this episode by examining what led to the French Revolution. In the 18th century, the king was the absolute ruler of France, ruling by the power of God. He had the authority to make decisions over the government of France, being able to silence any opposition within the existing parliament. At this time, France was experiencing a financial crisis, brought on by their involvement in the American Revolutionary War and the Anglo-French War, which had led to the government borrowing large sums of money. Social equality meant the lowest class, known as the Third Estate, had to pay the highest amount of tax, which had been raised with the aim of solving the financial crisis brought on by this war, and not entirely, but a large amount of this crisis was in fact brought on by the war. Tax reforms, including a universal land tax, the abolition of controls on grain and internal tariffs, and new assemblies to represent each province were proposed by Charles Collon, the finance minister, but were rejected by the government bodies that they were put to for approval. This was because, despite making up a small percentage of the population of France, these government decision-making bodies were dominated by the elites, who were naturally opposed to any reforms that would require them to pay taxes or would reduce their power and status. Although the king had the power to pass these laws by decree, some argue his status as a weak king meant he feared coming into conflict with the nobles that dominated the parliaments and other legislative bodies. The king established the Estates Generales, with their purpose being to make key decisions. The three main social classes formed it, the first estate being clergymen, the second estate being nobles, and the third estate being the commoners. However, the votes were counted by estate rather than by member, so despite making up less than 5% of the population of France, the first and second estates could combine their votes together and outvote the third estate. The Estates Generales met in Versailles on the 5th of May 1789 to vote on Finance Minister Necker's financial budget. The third estate voted to verify the membership of each estate and asked them to agree to votes being counted per head rather than by per estate. Negotiations ensued, which lasted until the 12th of June. After discussions got nowhere, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly of France and decreed that the current form of taxation, which disproportionately benefited the wealthy and overtaxed the poor, was illegal. Over the next 2 days, 100 clergymen of the Second Estate, which were local priests whose salaries were similar to that of the Third Estate, so they sympathised with the goals of the Third Estate, decided to join them in formation of the National Assembly of France. So, faced with nationwide turmoil and the prospect of a direct attack on the monarchy, King Louis was forced to accept the National Assembly, ordering the remaining clergy and nobility to join. However, political tensions only continued to escalate. The hugely popular Jacques Necker resigned as finance chief minister on the 11th of July, largely due to opposition. He faced huge opposition from the nobility, who disliked his tax reforms, which included introducing taxes on the upper classes. He also faced opposition from within the royal court, including Queen Marie Antoinette. So, many actually say that Necker was dismissed, although it is debated whether he was dismissed or resigned. Some historians do say that Necker was dismissed, and that the king advised him to leave the country. But as I mentioned, Necker was hugely popular, among the common people that is. So when news broke of his dismissal and apparent exile, there were attacks on officials and riots, including the burning and destruction of toll booths and tax offices. The city of Paris was in a state of unrest, fueled by food shortages, economic issues and political tensions caused by the absolute rule of Louis XVI and the elites. The people decided they needed weapons to defend themselves against the royal troops and believed that the Bastille, a fortress and prison, contained what they needed. On the 14th of July 1789, crowds of citizens gathered outside the Bastille and demanded that Governor Bernard-René de Launay surrender the fortress. When negotiations taking place between the revolutionaries and the governor came to a standstill, they stormed the Bastille, breaking in and engaging in violent clashes with the defenders of the Bastille. The fighting led to casualties on both sides, including the governor, who was dragged into the street and killed by the crowds. The governor, de Launay, eventually surrendered to prevent further bloodshed, obviously before he died. Although they believed that there were more prisoners inside the Bastille, the revolutionaries only found 7 and released them. To symbolise the revolution, the Bastille was gradually destroyed over the coming months. To appease the people, the king recalled Necker from his exile in Switzerland, again to serve as finance minister. The fall of the Bastille is often used by historians to mark the beginning of the French Revolution, and arguably it marked the beginning of a form of constitutional monarchy in France. The constitutional monarchy between July 1789 and September 1792 saw swathes of change across France. The newly established National Assembly passed the Declaration of Human and Civil Rights, which remains a part of French law today. It incorporated the basic concepts of freedom, equality, and the right to legal trial. These were the ideas championed by key Enlightenment thinkers Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Rousseau's work argued for a government that represented the majority of people. He campaigned for equal rights for all people in the eyes of the law. Voltaire advocated for freedom of thought, expression, and religion, and remained committed to science and logical thought. He was a critic of abuses of power by the monarchy and the church. Finally, Montesquieu was an opponent of government by absolute rule and believed that power should be divided within a government. He was also a proponent of a legal system that would support people's human and civil rights. A key event in the French Revolution was the Women's March on Versailles on the 5th of October 1789. Infuriated by the high price and lack of bread, women in the market squares of Paris and their revolutionary allies began a march to Versailles. Within 2 days, they had looted the city's armory, invaded the palace of Versailles, and forced the royal family, including the king and queen, to return with them to Paris, where they were forced to remain. In June 1791, Louis attempted to escape France, but was captured and brought back to Paris. His attempt at leaving his country infuriated the people of France, further striking up calls to abolish the monarchy. Later that month, he and his wife would again attempt to escape with the aim of seeking foreign assistance to combat the revolution. In July, the National Assembly finished drafting the new constitution, formalising Louis's position as a constitutional monarch. The National Assembly also abolished regional courts, separated the church and the state, and placed the power of creating law solely in the hands of the state. In April 1792, France declared war on Prussia, worsening internal tensions. Despite disorganisation within the army, when Prussia threatened to invade and reinstate the powers of the king in the Brunswick Manifesto of July 1792, the army quickly regrouped and managed to hold them off in battle. Meanwhile, Tuileries Palace, which housed the royal family, was seized and the monarchy was suspended. And in September, amid threats from foreign forces and nationwide instability, the September massacres erupted in Paris. This was where half the prison population of Paris, approximately 1,600 people, were executed after the Legislative Assembly called for volunteers to defend their country by killing the prisoners due to a fear that imprisoned Swiss mercenaries would be freed by invading armies to join the attack on Paris. In the end, the Prussians decided to withdraw, as the war was a stalemate and proving too costly. The successor to the Assembly, the National Convention, then abolished the French monarchy. The Reign of Terror was an 11th-month period characterised by intense violence, mass executions by guillotine, purges of political opposition to the state, and widespread fear and intimidation. We'll look at how it affected French society and transformed the French Revolution in the next episode, as well as conclude this two-parter about the French Revolution. Thanks for joining me after a 9-month-long break. The next episode will be released at the same time next week. Make sure you're subscribed to your streaming platforms so you are notified when it releases. Follow me on Instagram for advance updates on upcoming new episodes and ideas I have for future series. Thank you all for listening, and see you in the next episode. Goodbye.